Good evening, fellow Night Owls. I've had a bit more time to play video games lately, and this has me going through my backlog to see what would catch my eye. As I looked through my collection, I felt drawn to a game that has likely been on my backlog for as long as I've had a backlog, and I finally decided to sit down and play Ōkami. As I started to do research for this game, however, I found that there was a pretty strong consensus about Okami, and that was generally that it was one of the most successful financial failures in gaming history. I'm not here to disagree with the general consensus though. After my roughly 40-hour playthrough, I feel that its flaws and strengths have been talked about to death, and there are so many reviews that will say exactly the same thing. So I thought to myself, how could I cover Okami in a unique and interesting way? Well, remember 48 seconds ago when I said I have a bit more time to play games? Well, that's because I graduated from college. So I thought I could use my degrees in organizational leadership to analyze Okami's failure more thoroughly. I'm going to be using data focusing on the success of software products, as well as more general scholarship about the nature and spectrum of failure in organizations. I hope that by the end of this video that we'll all, as critics and fans of games, can come away with a better understanding of what we should consider a failure. So to organize this process, we're going to do this in 3 steps. In Chapter 1, we'll be talking about the release and how the game fared. Then, in Chapter 2, I'm going to cover Amy Edmonson's spectrum of reasons for failure. This will also include a definition of failure, as well as an example for each section on the spectrum of failure. And in Chapter 3, we'll examine Okami in light of this spectrum of failure to determine if the game is truly deserving of its world record. Okami was released in 2006 for the PlayStation 2 and was one of the last games for the system. It got a Wii port in 2008, which is where I first purchased the game. Now, I didn't get very far in the Wii version, but the Wii was powerful enough to run Okami fairly well, and I think that the Wii remote was perfectly made for the Celestial Brush. It adds a unique theming connection to the gameplay, and that's hard to replicate on current hardware. Then in 2012, we got Okami HD on the PS3, and in 2017, the game was ported to the Xbox One, PS4, and Steam. It also received the port to the Switch in 2018. Ah damn, ah damn, ah damn. Oh, also it came out on the Amazon Luna. Based off of Capcom's own published numbers, they say that this game has sold a combined 4 million units over its lifetime. But despite those low numbers, Okami currently sits at a 93 out of 100 on Metacritic. It won the grand prize at the 2006 Japan Media Arts Festival, and won Game of the Year as rated by the National Academy of Video Game Trade Reviewers. But all this being said, only a little more than 200,000 copies were sold in 2006, earning it the title of the Guinness Book of World Records least successful Game of the Year recipient. It didn't even crack the top 20 best-selling games of that year. It had to go up against a surprisingly similar Zelda, God of War 2, Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, and even the first Guitar Hero sequel. I mean, it's easy to get lost in the sauce. Those were games that came out just that month. We also got BioShock, Gears of War, Half-Life 2, Oblivion, and fucking Star Fox Command. In you go. Either way, low sales and strong competition doesn't necessarily make this game a failure. I mean, it won multiple awards. So since I'm not familiar with industry standards as far as success is concerned, I looked into a report generated by the Standish Group called the Chaos Report.
Are you Chaos?
Yeah, I just beat that game. It's fucking nuts. Are you Chaos?
Chaos? Chaos? Chaos!
The Chaos, or Comprehensive Human Appraisal for Originating Software report, seems to be the most credible source of software project management data. In this report, they highlight 3 conditions for success: on time, on budget, and list satisfactory results. To quote them directly, this means that the project was resolved within a reasonable estimated time, stayed within budget, and delivered customer and user satisfaction regardless of the original scope. I found this report really interesting and recommend you check it out if this is the type of analysis that rustles your jimmy. You can find the link to this and all other cited sources in the video's description. But hey, psst! While you're down there looking for that article, if you could click the subscribe button for me, you don't even have to watch any more of my videos. Just select this button over here to never get notified, or get notified if that's something you're into. So anyways, a software project can be successful in one area, but less successful in other areas. In their complimentary report on reasons for success, the Standish Group rates the outcome of a project by describing it as successful, challenged, or failed. Successful means that it was on time, on budget, and with satisfactory outcome. If the project is challenged, that means one of these issues was breached. Either the software development went late, over budget, or with an unsatisfactory product. Failed means that the project is either abandoned or canceled outright. Now that we know what constitutes a failure, let's move on to step 2, failure analysis.
I shouldn't have served those North Korean fortune cookies. They were so insulting. You are a coward. No one likes to hear that after a nice meal.
You can't keep blaming yourself. Just blame yourself once and move on.
It's pretty commonly known that every team goes through some type of failure. I mean, I didn't release Mighty Number 9, but somebody did. I think how a company handles failure will tell you everything you need to know about them. Some companies take the opportunities that failures present to metaphorically patch holes in their processes. Some look for someone to blame, and still others will look for a scapegoat. No matter who or what causes a failure, we have to find the source of the failure before we can analyze it and implement a change. We can classify failures using the spectrum of reasons for failure. This was developed by Amy Edmonson, a Harvard Business School professor, to help organizations find the source of a failure. Each level of failure on the scale briefly explains the general type of failure, and each item can be easily grouped into 3 categories. You can also see a gradient of blame across the entire spectrum. Let's go over each of these categories, provide an example for each type of failure, and this way we'll be able to differentiate between the types of failures in the gaming industry. The first category of failures fall into the preventable failures and predictable operations camp, and are generally found in jobs with high volumes of routine operations, such as manufacturing or services. So let's go over the first 3 failures in our spectrum. Deviance means that something or someone knowingly commits actions that go against the stated goals of the project. I don't think that there are too many games where the developers purposefully sabotage games, but an excellent example of deviance in gaming is Warren Robinette. In the late 70s at Atari, management had a policy of not crediting the creators of games. Warren went against the directives of his bosses and added his name in a secret room of 1978's Adventure. This is a pretty clear-cut case of deviance. Warren even admits as much. While this decision was positively received by Atari's audience, senior management's restrictive policies led to many good programmers walking away, and Atari closed soon after Adventure's release. Inattention in games, to me, happens mostly when a game tries to lean too hard on its systems, and then the basics of gameplay are neglected. A game like Dark Void kind of comes to mind. This game isn't totally bad, but it definitely was too bland to make its jetpack traversal worth it. The vertical cover system was neat, and the jetpack controls were fun, but almost everything else about the game came up kinda bland. Games failing due to inattention aren't bad on purpose, but I could see a world where the team is really focused on the marquee aspect of a game, and the rest of the game is simply required to work. But it's not all bad. We got a DSi sequel that was actually pretty damn good. The last failure in this category is lack of ability. This applies to lacking the skills, conditions, or training needed to execute a job. And honestly, I think the biggest offender in this category are licensed games. I could see many scenarios where license holders are expecting a much higher quality game than they are willing to pay for. This can lead to scenarios where either the licensor goes with a less experienced developer, or severe cuts to the original scope of the game have to come into play. I'll throw out the recent King Kong game as a recent example of a licensed game gone wrong. It just doesn't look or feel like King Kong, and I think even a casual observer of games would say that this looks outdated. If you don't have the money or talent to make a game, then it will likely not be well received by the gaming market. The middle section of our failure scale is what Edmonson refers to as unavoidable failures in complex systems. These types of failures are less due to an individual or client, but due to the complexity of the project. Also, blame and failure is less clearly focused on an individual. For example, a failure due to a process inadequacy means that the failure was due to a workflow that isn't really optimal or comprehensive. This can happen when leaders do not listen to the changing needs of workers, or managers get stuck in their ways. The whole Connect lineup kind of feels like that to me. I mean, I had a Kinect back in the day, and it was fun for a few minutes, but ultimately the requirements for the development for a Kinect, I think, were being explored, so processes for game development hadn't been solidified before the accessory was ready for release. In this case, an emerging technology made an old system of developing games obsolete. Not because of anyone's specific actions, but because the addition to the Xbox 360 was so radically different from that of traditional controls. And games for the Kinect might have been developed before firm processes could be put into place. This is a good example of how blameworthiness kind of evaporates at this level, because if a process is rushed, is it the game director's fault? I mean, probably not. Maybe it was the executives, or we would blame the people that promoted those executives. I just want to clarify that because many people speculate on why a game like Okami was a sales failure, and often there's pressure to blame someone, and at this level it kind of gets hard to blame anyone. The next category of failure are task challenges. This is where an individual or a team faces a task too difficult to be executed reliably every time. And for this one, I'm actually going to go with a recent game, Helldivers 2. With the surprise popularity of their game, they simply didn't foresee the total number of players that would be on their server. So unfortunately, they had to implement wait times during peak hours of play. At time of filming, Arrowhead Game Studios have fixed this issue and have totally turned the game around, adding mechs even. Our third and final failure for this middle section is failure due to process complexity. And this one's pretty simple. Basically, if a very complex process is interrupted by a novel procedure, then the whole thing falls apart. I know it can be pretty easy to kind of pick on games that ship to market broken, but I think a company that has a reputation for this sort of game is Bethesda. In Skyrim, we had backwards flying dragons, and the PS3 port was initially broken for some time. The PC port for Fallout New Vegas barely runs unless you mod it all the way to hell and back. And even Starfield had a glitch for some time where if you put a gun in a display case in the armory of your ship, it would just disappear. But many of these Bethesda experiences are very honestly just huge and vast experiences. That's not necessarily trying to give them a pass for the status of the games that they ship. I really would prefer that these games just work when they're released. And they honestly fix a lot of the bugs, and while we might consider these broken in their initial shipped stages, and some of these games are still broken to this day, all of these games are far from financial failures, so it would be really hard to just flat out say, these games are failures. Alright, we're in the home stretch. These last three failures are intelligent failures. In this category, testing can often lead to advances in gaming that, while technically a failure, gives the team valuable data about where the industry is heading. The first failure in this category is a failure due to uncertainty. Basically, a team can make an excellent game, and then, through no fault of its own, the game fails to succeed. I think that Advance Wars is a great example. I've already done a whole video about Advance Wars 1+2 Reboot Camp, so if you want the full story, go ahead and check that video out. But when the remake of Advance Wars 1+2 Reboot Camp was announced, I think it's fair to say that it was universally anticipated.
Unless, of course, war were declared.
What's that?
War were declared.
Yeah, Russia invaded Ukraine, and Nintendo put the remake back in the shed for a little bit. The game did eventually release about a year later, but the air was out of the tires for that game a little bit. And what's wild is that's not actually even the first time that this has happened to the Advance Wars series. I mean, there's no way that anyone at WayForward or Nintendo could have foreseen that war were declared. And that just goes to show you that sometimes fate just isn't kind to a game. And then sometimes you're Animal Crossing, releasing at the beginning of the pandemic. This next failure is hypothesis testing. This is generally reserved for testing out an idea to see if it fails or not, and many might think of this as only applying to R&D, but I think that this can happen to finished products as well. I submit to you for this section the PlayStation Vita. The Vita was estimated to have sold about 16 million units over its whole lifetime, and that's pretty respectable. And many reviewers at the time really liked it, but had a few gripes with it. It was big compared to other handheld game systems at the time, and it was super expensive. It also had proprietary memory cards and really expensive games. So while the console might have tested well internally, and maybe even in focus groups, those numbers can't really tell the whole story. In reality, mobile gamers were kind of moving to cell phones. They have free or cheap games, and you always have your phone on you.
Then you're strafing your enemies with your AK-47! You've never strafed before, but it feels great!
But I think that this type of failure is really beneficial for Sony. For example, they recently released the PS Portal, and for better or worse, they have learned some lessons from the PS Vita. And our last section of failure is exploratory testing. Now, this is really the cutting edge of cutting edge, and these are the failures that are the result of experiments, where the outcome could not really be known. This one was really kind of hard, and I don't know if it actually really is a very clear example, but I like to think of The Legend of Zelda: Wind Waker. Now, Nintendo delivered a game that was completely different from the initial prototype that Nintendo demoed. When Nintendo showed us a more realistic style of Zelda game, people got a little PO'd. People thought they were getting what the demo showed, and boy howdy did they get a different experience. A great different experience in my opinion, but Wind Waker was initially critically hailed, but there were definitely some rather loud dissenters. They wanted a gritty and realistic Zelda, or so they thought, and I mean they would eventually get that with Twilight Princess. But it's interesting to see how the final product of the Wind Waker failed to meet the initial expectations of the tech demo that we were shown, and it's my favorite Zelda of the generation. Considering the scale that we just reviewed, there are multiple ways that Ōkami could be considered a failure. Aspects of the game like a clunky fast travel system, a pervy guide, and an inconsistent dialogue quality all are kind of marks against it. But I think that Ōkami's best aspects are where it shines, and it kind of drowns out the small and admittedly annoying at best problems. But if we're going to accept that in some ways Ōkami was a failure, what kind of lesson should we take from it? My professional analysis kind of agrees with the story of Ōkami, and I find it kind of ironic that one of the game's main story arcs was finding purpose. Throughout the story, you help various NPCs come to terms with a tragedy in the story. You help Susanoo train and gain the confidence to be the hero that Kamiki Village needs. You defeat the Orochi and save Kushi and become the protector of Kami Village, giving Susanoo purpose. If you had not helped him on this quest, the villagers would not be accepting of him as a protector. Without proving his worth, Susanoo was just a lazy, drunk swordsman. Another great example is Isun, the Ponkel, who also seems to initially fight with what he thinks is his purpose. His father had hoped that he would become a celestial envoy, but Isun wanted to become one of the world's most renowned artists. But even in Isun running away from his home, it kind of led him to meet Amaterasu and fulfill his destiny. Despite being annoyingly horny the entire time, Isun actually got a tear out of me as he showed genuine sadness at having to part ways with Amaterasu. Isun accepted his purpose in order for Amaterasu to save Nippon, and he gives into his father's prophecy about him to become a celestial envoy. So I think that Ōkami is a creative and gorgeous sales and performance failure. It's kind of fitting that a game of such beauty would be able to teach us so much. But now that this game is off my backlog, the only way that Ōkami HD could truly be a failure is if you refuse to learn the lesson that it teaches. My name is Cody Smith, and we'll see you tonight. Hire me, please.
Ah! 1 kill! 2 kills! Triple kill, bitches! He just hit the fuel tank! Yeah! Yeah! Ah!
Or you could just edit spreadsheets.